Before we begin this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss stories like this one. Now let's dive in. Sarah Mitchell never imagined her life would lead to this moment. She grew up in a small town in Texas where her father owned a repair shop. From the age of 7, she was handing him wrenches and learning the names of every tool in the garage. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Sarah was covered in grease, helping her dad fix old trucks and tractors. Her mother worried she would never fit in, but her father always told her that knowing how to fix things was a gift that would take her places. When Sarah turned 18, she knew college wasn't for her. She loved working with her hands too much to sit in a classroom. Her father supported her decision to join the military, hoping it would give her structure and opportunity. The recruiter's office was intimidating with its stark walls and serious faces, but Sarah walked in with confidence. She scored high on the mechanical aptitude test, which surprised no one who knew her. Within months, she was shipped off to basic training. Leaving behind her small town and everything familiar, basic training was harder than anything Sarah had ever experienced. The physical demands pushed her body to limits she didn't know existed. She ran miles in the scorching heat, crawled through mud under barbed wire, and learned to shoot weapons she had only seen in movies. But it was the mental challenge that really tested her. Drill sergeants yelled in her face, questioning whether a woman belonged in their ranks. Some nights, alone in her bunk, Sarah wondered if they were right. But then she would remember her father's words about her gift. She pushed forward. After basic training, Sarah was assigned to a forward operating base in a hostile region overseas. The base was surrounded by mountains and dust, whirled away from the green fields of Texas. Her job was simple on paper, but critical in practice. She was responsible for maintaining the vehicles that transported soldiers on missions. Humvees, transport trucks, and specialized tactical vehicles all came under her care. If a vehicle failed during a mission, lives were at risk. Sarah understood this responsibility deeply and took pride in her work. The other mechanics on base were all men, and at first they didn't take her seriously. They gave her the worst jobs, the dirtiest repairs, the vehicles that seemed beyond fixing. They wanted to see her fail. But Sarah never complained. She showed up early, stayed late, and fixed every single vehicle they threw at her. Her hands moved with precision and speed that came from years of experience. Slowly, grudgingly, the men began to respect her. They stopped testing her and started treating her like one of them. Life on base fell into a rhythm. Wake up before dawn, check the vehicle logs, prioritize repairs, work through the heat of the day. Sarah made a few friends among the support staff. There was Maria, a medic from California who had a sharp sense of humor that made the long days bearable. There was Jackson, a supply sergeant from Georgia who always made sure Sarah had the parts she needed, even when supplies ran short. These friendships made the base feel a little less lonely, a little more like home. One evening, Sarah was working late in the motor pool. The sun had set hours ago, and the base was quiet except for the distant sound of generators humming. She was underneath a Humvee, replacing a damaged axle that had taken damage from rough terrain. Her hands were black with grease, and sweat dripped down her face despite the cool night air. This was where she felt most at peace, solving problems one bolt at a time. She had no idea that everything was about to change, that her quiet life as a base mechanic was about to be shattered by events beyond her control. The mission briefing happened in a secured room that Sarah had never entered before. She wasn't supposed to be there at all, but Sergeant Hayes had specifically requested her presence. The room was filled with officers and senior enlisted personnel, their faces grave. On the screen at the front of the room was a map marked with red dots and coordinates that meant nothing to Sarah. Sergeant Hayes stood at attention as the commanding officer explained the situation. A SEAL team had been sent deep into enemy territory to extract a high-value target. They had completed their mission but were ambushed during extraction. Communication had been lost 6 hours ago. The room erupted in quiet but intense discussion. Sarah stood near the back, feeling out of place among these combat veterans. She wondered why she was there until Sergeant Hayes turned and called her forward. He explained that the rescue convoy needed every available vehicle. but 3 of their most heavily armored transports had critical mechanical issues. Parts were delayed due to a sandstorm grounding supply flights. Sarah was their only hope of getting those vehicles operational in time. The commanding officer looked at her with eyes that held no room for failure. He asked her one question. Could she do it? Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. 3 vehicles, multiple complex issues, and a timeline measured in hours rather than days. Every instinct told her to explain why it was impossible to list the reasons why she needed more time and more resources. But then, she thought about those SEALs trapped behind enemy lines, counting on someone to come get them. She thought about the families waiting for them back home. She looked the commanding officer in the eye and said, yes, she could do it. The motor pool became her battlefield. Sarah moved with focused intensity, her mind calculating every step before her hands executed it. The first vehicle had a damaged transmission that was leaking fluid. She didn't have a replacement, so she had to rebuild it using parts from a damaged vehicle that had been written off weeks ago. Her hands moved quickly, removing bolts and seals, cleaning components, reassembling everything with precision. Jackson appeared beside her with tools and parts, anticipating what she needed before she asked. He had volunteered to help, refusing to leave her to work alone. The second vehicle had electrical problems that had stumped the other mechanics for days. The engine would start, but then die randomly, making it unreliable for combat situations. Sarah traced every wire, checking connections and testing circuits. She found the problem in a junction box that had corroded from the constant dust and heat. She bypassed the damaged section and rerouted the electrical flow. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The engine roared to life and stayed running. She allowed herself one moment of satisfaction before moving to the third vehicle. The third vehicle was the worst. The engine had thrown a rod, causing internal damage that normally would require a complete engine replacement. Sarah didn't have a replacement engine. She didn't even have time to properly repair the damage. She made a decision that went against everything she had been taught. She would patch the damage enough to get the vehicle through one mission. It was risky, and the engine might fail at any moment, but it was better than sending the rescue team one vehicle short. She worked through the night, her body running on adrenaline and determination. As dawn broke over the base, Sarah tightened the last bolt on the third vehicle. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, and her vision was blurry from lack of sleep. But all 3 vehicles were ready. The rescue convoy assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, soldiers checking weapons and equipment. Sarah watched them load into the vehicles she had saved. The commanding officer stopped beside her briefly. He didn't say anything, just gave her a single nod of acknowledgement. Then the convoy rolled out, disappearing into the desert. The hours after the convoy departed were the longest of Sarah's life. She tried to sleep but couldn't. She tried to eat but had no appetite. She sat in the motor pool, staring at the empty spaces where the 3 vehicles had been parked. Maria found her there and sat beside her in silence. They didn't need words. Everyone on base felt the tension, the waiting, the hoping. Radio chatter was minimal and encrypted, so no one knew what was happening out there in the desert. Sarah kept thinking about that third vehicle and the patched engine that might fail at any moment. The base commander had ordered increased security. Intelligence suggested that enemy forces knew about the trapped SEAL team and were actively hunting them. There was also concern that the enemy might have learned about the base's location and could launch an attack. Sarah was ordered to prepare additional vehicles in case they were needed for evacuation. She went through the motions mechanically, checking fuel levels and tire pressure, but her mind was miles away with that convoy. She kept checking her watch, calculating how long the journey would take, how long the rescue operation might last, when they might return. Hours turned into an eternity. Then, finally, the radio crackled to life. The rescue convoy had made contact with the SEAL team, but the situation was worse than anticipated. The SEALs were pinned down in a compound surrounded by enemy fighters. The rescue force was heavily outnumbered. They needed air support, but the nearest helicopters were hours away. The base erupted into controlled chaos. Every available soldier was put on standby. Sarah heard officers shouting orders, saw troops grabbing gear and running to assembly points. She felt helpless, stuck on base while people were dying in the desert. Then something unexpected happened. Incoming fire hit the base perimeter. Explosions rocked the compound as mortar landed near the outer walls. The enemy had indeed learned the base's location and had launched a coordinated attack. It was a diversion, an attempt to prevent reinforcements from reaching the trapped rescue convoy. Alarms blared across the base. Soldiers took defensive positions along the walls. Sarah found herself running toward the motor pool, not away from the danger, but toward it. If the base was under attack, vehicles would be damaged. They might need her. The attack was chaotic and terrifying. Sarah had never been in direct combat before. She heard the crack of bullets hitting metal and concrete. She saw tracer rounds lighting up the darkening sky. An explosion near the fuel depot sent a plume of black smoke into the air. Through the chaos, she saw one of the guard towers take a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. The tower collapsed, and she could see soldiers trapped in the rubble. Without thinking, Sarah ran toward them. Training kicked in that she didn't even know she had. She pulled debris away, ignoring the pain in her hands and the continued gunfire around her. She helped pull 2 soldiers from the wreckage. One was unconscious. The other had a badly broken leg. Maria appeared with her medical kit, working quickly to stabilize them. Sarah looked around at the base she had called home for months. It was being torn apart. Fires burned in multiple locations. The sound of gunfire was constant. She saw the commanding officer organizing the defense, directing fire toward enemy positions outside the walls. In that moment, something changed inside Sarah. She realized that being a mechanic didn't exempt her from being a soldier. Everyone on this base was in danger, and everyone had to fight. She made a decision that would change everything. Sarah ran to the armory, her boots pounding against the concrete. The armory sergeant was handing out weapons to anyone who could hold them. When Sarah reached for a rifle, he hesitated for just a moment, seeing the grease still on her hands, recognizing her as the mechanic who spent her days under vehicles. But this wasn't a day for hesitation. He handed her an M4 rifle, magazines of ammunition, and a quick reminder of her basic training. Check your weapon, watch your sectors, and stay alive. Sarah nodded, her hands surprisingly steady as she loaded the magazine. The base defenses were holding, but barely. Enemy fighters had taken positions in the hills surrounding the compound, giving them a tactical advantage. They were picking off defenders systematically. The commanding officer was trying to organize a counterattack, but they were spread too thin. Too many people were committed to the rescue convoy, and the remaining defenders were barely enough to hold the perimeter. Sarah took a position behind a concrete barrier, her heart hammering in her chest. She had fired weapons in training, but this was different. These targets would shoot back. The first time Sarah fired her weapon in combat, everything seemed to slow down. She saw an enemy fighter moving between rocks on the hillside, his rifle aimed at the base. She lined up her sights, controlled her breathing like she had been taught, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The enemy fighter dropped. She didn't feel triumph or horror. She felt nothing except the need to survive and protect the people around her. She kept firing, working through her magazine with methodical precision. Each shot was measured, controlled, purposeful. Jackson appeared beside her, taking up a firing position. His face was set in grim determination. They worked together, calling out targets and covering each other's sectors. Sarah's mechanical mind served her well in combat. She calculated angles and distances, predicted enemy movements, conserved ammunition. When her rifle jammed, she cleared it in seconds, her hands moving with the same confidence they showed when repairing engines. The enemy fire was intense, but the defenders were holding their ground. Sarah could hear the commanding officer on the radio, requesting air support, requesting reinforcements, requesting anything that could help them survive. Then the situation got worse. The enemy launched a coordinated assault on the main gate. Dozens of fighters rushed the entrance, using smoke grenades for cover. The defenders concentrated their fire, but the sheer number of attackers was overwhelming. Sarah saw the gate beginning to buckle under explosive charges. If the enemy breached the gate, they would flood into the base. Hand-to-hand combat would follow. Many would die. Sarah looked around desperately for something, anything that could turn the tide. Her eyes fell on one of the damaged vehicles near the motor pool, a transport truck that had been waiting for repairs. Sarah had an idea. It was crazy, probably suicidal, but it might work. She shouted to Jackson, explaining her plan. His eyes widened, and he started to argue, but then another explosion rocked the gate. There was no time for debate. Sarah ran to the damaged truck while Jackson provided covering fire. Bullets pinged off the metal around her as she yanked open the door and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine was damaged but not dead. She had worked on this truck just days ago. She knew its problems, knew its limits. She turned the key, and the engine coughed to life. It sounded terrible, missing cylinders and burning oil, but it ran. That was all she needed. Sarah slammed the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The damaged engine screamed in protest, but the truck lurched forward. She aimed directly at the main gate, where enemy fighters were clustering, preparing for their final push into the base. Some of the defenders realized what she was doing and ceased fire, giving her a clear path. The truck picked up speed, rattling and shaking, threatening to come apart at any moment. Sarah gripped the wheel with white knuckles, her eyes locked on the target. This was insane. This was necessary. The enemy fighters at the gate saw the truck coming too late. Sarah crashed through the damaged gate, the impact throwing her forward against the steering wheel, even with her seatbelt locked. The truck plowed into the mass of enemy fighters, scattering them like bowling pins. Metal twisted and glass shattered. The engine finally gave up, dying with a final, shuddering gasp. For a moment, everything was still. Sarah sat dazed in the driver's seat, her head ringing from the impact. Then bullets started hitting the truck. She was outside the base now, surrounded by enemy fighters who were recovering from their shock. Sarah kicked open the damaged door and rolled out, bringing her rifle up. She took cover behind the truck's engine block, the only part that would stop bullets. Enemy fighters were closing in from all sides. She fired controlled bursts, dropping targets one by one, but there were too many. She was going to die out here. She had known that when she made the decision to drive through the gate, but she had bought the base precious time. The defenders were already moving to secure the breached gate, setting up a new defensive line. Her sacrifice would not be meaningless. Then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The roar of heavy weapons from behind her. Jackson had commandeered one of the armored vehicles and driven through the gate after her. He was manning the mounted machine gun, laying down devastating fire that forced the enemy fighters to scatter and seek cover. Other defenders followed, pushing out from the base, turning defense into offense. Sarah used the distraction to reload and reposition. She was no longer alone. The tide was turning. The fight became a blur of movement and gunfire. Sarah moved from cover to cover, her training and instincts taking over. She stopped thinking and simply reacted. Target, fire, move, check corners, watch flanks, conserve ammunition. She worked alongside soldiers she had only known in passing, defending each other without words. The enemy fighters began to retreat, realizing their assault had failed. The base defenders pursued them into the hills, ensuring they wouldn't regroup for another attack. Sarah finally allowed herself to stop, leaning against a rock, her body shaking from adrenaline crash. When the commanding officer found her, Sarah was sitting in the dirt, her rifle across her lap, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without speaking. Around them, medics were treating wounded, while other soldiers secured the perimeter. The base was damaged but standing. The enemy attack had been repulsed. After a long silence, commanding officer told her that the rescue convoy had successfully extracted the SEAL team and was on its way back. All personnel were alive, though some were injured. The vehicles Sarah had repaired had performed flawlessly. Even the patched engine had held together. Sarah nodded slowly, letting the news sink in. They had won. They had all won. The days following the battle were strange for Sarah. She became something of a legend on the base. Oh, she hated the attention. Soldiers she had never spoken to before approached her with respect and gratitude. The SEAL team she had helped rescue came to the motor pool to meet her personally. These were hardened warriors who had seen combat around the world, and they treated her as an equal. Their commander, a weathered officer with decades of experience, shook her hand and told her that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being terrified and doing what needed to be done anyway. Sarah returned to her regular duties in the motor pool, but everything felt different. She looked at the vehicles with new eyes now. Each one she repaired could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers who depended on them. The work that had once seemed routine now felt sacred. Her fellow mechanics treated her differently too. The last traces of doubt about her abilities vanished. They came to her with their most difficult problems, trusting her judgment and skill. She had proven herself in the only way that truly mattered. The base commander recommended Sarah for the Bronze Star for her actions during the battle. The official citation mentioned her bravery in maintaining critical vehicles under impossible conditions and her courage in combat when the base came under attack. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the recognition, believing she had only done what anyone would have done. But Maria told her that was exactly why she deserved it. Real heroes never think they're heroes. They just do what needs to be done and then go back to work. When Sarah's deployment ended months later, she was surprised by how much she would miss the base. She had arrived as a scared young mechanic hoping to prove herself. She was leaving as a decorated combat veteran who had earned the respect of everyone around her. The night before she left, the motor pool crew threw her a small party. They gave her a wrench engraved with her name and the dates of her deployment. Jackson made a speech that brought tears to her eyes, talking about how she had shown everyone what it meant to be both skilled and brave. Sarah returned home to Texas, but she wasn't the same person who had left. Her father picked her up from the airport, and when he hugged her, she held on longer than usual. Over dinner that night, she tried to explain what she had experienced, but the words felt inadequate. How could she describe the fear, the exhaustion, the moment when she decided to drive that truck through the gate? Her father listened patiently, then told her something she would never forget. He said that he had always known she was special, that the gift he saw in her wasn't just about fixing engines. It was about fixing problems, about seeing what needed to be done and finding a way to do it. Years later, Sarah would occasionally be asked about her time in the military. She never told the full story. She would mention that she had been a mechanic on a base overseas, that she had done her job and come home. But sometimes, late at night, she would take out that engraved wrench and remember. She would remember the sound of gunfire and the smell of burning fuel. She would remember Jackson fighting beside her and Maria patching up the wounded. She would remember the SEAL team commander's handshake and his words about courage. She had been just a base mechanic, a girl from Texas who was good with tools. But when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance, she had become something more. She had become exactly who she needed to be, and that had made all the difference.